to my channel. If you haven't been here before, welcome back if you watch my videos. And if you do, as always, I thank you so much. I love to upcycle clothing and accessories, especially purses. Purses were my bread and butter for years. This is where I started when I started selling online, creating upcycled purses. And this is made out of blazers and a part of a dress. And they're just one of a kind, beautiful pieces of wearable art. And this is what we're working on today. And this is a pretty long tutorial, so I have it in two parts. And this is part one. And mainly we're working on the front of the bag in this one. So let's get going. Okay, so these are the thrifted items I'm making my bag out of. And I have this teal blazer, well, teal and black. This purple blazer, which is like a 2X. So it's larger and it gives me a lot of fabric to work with. And it's fairly soft, almost velvety. I have this velvety velour vest. And then I have this dress that has some pretty roses on it. And I wish I could give you a magic formula for mixing and matching patterns, but I personally have a huge work table and sometimes it is just loaded with fabrics that I've pulled off my shelf, laying them on top of one another and seeing what I like. Now for this bag, I know I wanted rich jewel tones and I know I wanted purple. So I first found the purple. And it has a little black in it. And I think purple and teal are great together. And it has a little black. And so I just expanded from there. Now, the best way to start, I would say, if you don't know what you want to make for sure, is find an inspiration piece. Like at the thrift store, I love blazers because they usually have a thicker fabric. A lot of times they're soft and they have great patterns. But other than blazers, you can go to the home decor department. Sometimes curtains are really pretty patterned fabrics, tablecloths, bedspreads, things like that. So I would just start with one piece that you love and then just expand off that. Just kind of play with different patterns and blazers and be at the thrift store and pile your cart up with some fun patterns and stuff. I love doing that. Another way to start is with an inspiration piece. And I love sewing jewelry onto my bags. And so sometimes I've started with like a statement necklace, and go take it with me to the thrift store and mix and match patterns that are in similar colors. And then your great necklace is going to work with the bag. So good luck with that. I know it can be time consuming to kind of pick out your different patterns. And another thing is, the rule when I was always growing up or whatever to mix and match patterns was go large scale with small scale, like say large floral with a small polka dot or small stripe. I don't do that. These boho bags are just no fun if you're doing that and paying too much attention to the rules. I have no rules. I just like what I like and go from there. Okay, so I just want to start by making my pattern. And I have a piece of packing paper here I like to make my patterns with, but also wrapping paper. The backs of wrapping paper make great patterns, especially if you have larger pieces. So this is just 15¼ inches tall by 17 inches across. And I made a little arrow to remind myself which way is up. So once I have my rectangle cut out, I just simply fold it in half. And then on the opposite side, here's the fold, not on the fold side, but on the opposite side across the top from this edge over, I measured 3.25 inches and made a mark with my marker. Okay, and then from the bottom up, I measured up 4 inches from the very bottom and made a mark with my marker. And then now I just simply take my ruler line those marks up. Connect those dots. And then now I go from the very corner on the folded side to this dot. Like that. Okay, and while it's still folded, I'm just going to cut along those lines. And you can do any shape you want. You can do a square, you can do a U shape with a curved bottom. This is just how I want this purse to be. And now I have the shape that I want. It sort of tapers out on the side and then tapers back in at the bottom here. Okay, so you'll want to make 2 of these. We need one intact like this, and then the other one we are going to cut up to create our patterns for the purse. Okay, so just pick one of your pattern pieces to work with here, and then you fold this one in half. Now I have the fold on this side, and I will take my ruler and I will come in on this open side while it's folded in half, 1.75 inches, and make a mark from the top corner here over 1.75 inches. Now I'll go down to the bottom corner, this edge right here, and I will go in 4.25 inches and make a mark. And then this curve, I just freehanded that. And I did that in pencil first to make sure I liked the look so I could erase if I didn't. And then once I liked the look, I just drew over it with my marker. And now I'm just going to cut along that line. And this is what it looks like after you cut along that line. Now, at this point, I always do this. I just kind of make little notes to myself that this is the front side. I make an F, and it's the left. So I make an L, FL, front left, and then front middle, FM, and then front right. That way I don't get confused. Is this upside down? And then you can make a little arrow too. That way when these are all messed up on my table, I can go to it and okay, I know this side goes up and it's the left side of the purse. Okay, so the next thing that I did was I went to my purple blazer and cut it up a little bit. This is the back, and this was actually the sleeve. I cut off the sleeve and cut it open, so I had a larger piece of fabric. And I just set my larger pattern piece that's still intact on top of the fabric, and with a piece of chalk, I traced it, and I did it twice, and just simply cut it out. Now, I was lucky that I had a large blazer to work with, because this purple will actually be the sides of my pattern. So all I'll have to do is cut out one piece and lay it right down the middle like this. But if you have smaller jackets or just fabric remnants and you don't have a large piece to do this with, all it does is save you an extra step. You can do this, and I've done this many, many times. So I take, now this has lint all over it, but okay, so I just take, this is a sheet, a thin piece of cotton, you know, like a quilter weight, something like that, and I take my larger pattern that's intact, and I just trace over this. And now you'll want to do this twice because there's a front and a back. So just trace around that and cut it out. And then you can take your side pieces that we cut out and create the sides. And you will have to sew those on. See, like that. And then this pattern in the middle will be a different fabric. So, doing it, cutting it off your jacket in this one large piece or off your fabric just saves you this extra step. And to sew this one on, you just stitch around the sides in a matching thread and just stay as close to the edge as you can. And don't worry about this being a raw edge, because we'll be covering that up with trim. So that's just another way to do it. And I just want to give you one helpful hint that I've learned the hard way. When you trace your pattern, now this, I wrote front for a reason, because I want, if my pattern is facing up, this is the right side of my fabric, I want to lay this down. I want to see these letters. But if I were to turn this fabric over, say you have a really busy pattern and you don't want to draw on it and because it's hard to see, and you want to use them more solid on the back, if I'm tracing on the back of the fabric, I also have to turn this over. Just a little helpful hint. I cut out like a whole purse that way one time, thinking it would just be the same. I don't know what I was thinking, but if you turn your fabric over, turn your pattern over, and be sure you write whatever this is, front right, and an arrow. It just helps you when you're assembling it. Okay, so the next thing I did was I went to that teal and black colored blazer, and I just kind of cut it open. I cut the sleeves off and cut it across at the shoulders just to open it up and give me space to work with. And I took my middle pattern and laid it on the fabric, traced around it with a piece of chalk and cut it out. And I did that twice. One for the front and one for the back. And now all I'm going to do is take that piece we just cut out and put it on the center of each piece of purple fabric that I have, and just kind of line it up so that it's in the center. And I did this one already, and then I just pinned it on. And now I'll get this one pinned on. Okay, so now I'm just going to go to my machine and use a coordinating thread. I'll probably use teal or black, and I will just go around all the edges of this piece, and I will stay as close as I can to the edge, but I don't have to get ridiculously close because this will all be covered up with sewing, fringes and trims and things like that. So I'll go to the machine and get both these sewn on. Okay, so now I have the center sewn on, and I'm going to choose one to be the front of my bag, and it doesn't matter, mine are pretty much exactly the same. So I'll set one aside for now. The front will look a little bit different than the back, and so we are just going to work on the front now. So I went to that sort of paisley vest, that's that velour, and I cut a strip of fabric out that's 24 inches by 3.5. It's 3.5 inches wide. And I am going to lay that at the bottom of my bag here. And then I will just sort of miter this front. And I'm not an expert at mitering. I just kind of fold it over until it looks nice. And then when I have it where I think it looks nice and even, I'll stick a pin in it. So my pins are over at my sewing machine, but so this 24 inches will be a little bit long, but I'd rather have a little extra to trim off than not enough. So now I am just going to get this pinned on, and then I will go to my machine, and again with a fairly small stitch, I'll probably use like a gold thread and just go around the edges, so that mitered spot right there, and completely go around. Then I'll have to trim that off there when I'm all done. Okay, so I have the bottom piece sewn on, and now I want to sew a cute little half circle piece for up here. So I made a little pattern just out of copy paper, and it's straight at the top and just sort of a wide U shape. And it's 6 inches across the top here and 5 inches tall. And I just freehanded it. It's easiest if you fold it in half and kind of draw half your circle or half your U shape. But anyway, that's the pattern that I made. And then I went to that floral dress and I found a pretty flower that I wanted for my piece. And I just, on the dress, laid my pattern down, traced it with chalk, cut it out, and this is what I have. And now I'm going to center it at the top, right here. And then I will pin that on, and then go to my machine, and again, stitch across the top, all the way around the sides, using a fairly small straight stitch, staying close to the edges. Okay, so now it's time to play with fringes and trims. And I get my fringes and trims all over the place. I get some from the thrift store, but you can't find it in like a bolt at a thrift store very often. So I look at like bedspreads and curtains and things like that that have tassels and fringes to cut off. I also get some from eBay, Hobby Lobby. Sometimes, like, I got 5 yards of this pretty trim at Hobby Lobby. It was on sale, 5 yards for $2.48. I mean, that is a really good deal. So if I find good deals like that, I'll pick it up. Otherwise, flea markets, things like that. So let's get to fringing. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is cover up these middle sides here. They have kind of an unattractive stitching, seam, raw edges right there. And I want to cover those up. And I always start in the middle part because when I sew trim here, then it hides the end of the trim that you had just sewn on. So I always cut my trim a little bit larger than what I need, and then I trim it tight and close when I'm all done. So I'll just start like this trim right at the very bottom here, and this is kind of wide, so I will stitch it twice. I'll probably use gold thread and go down one side and then go down the other. And I want this line right here in the center of my trim. So I'll go to my machine, I'll butt it up to this wide piece that we sewed down here, and I'll go this way with the sewing machine, and then I'll line this up on the middle of that line, sew down one edge until I get to this floral piece of fabric, and then I'll go back and sew down the other edge, and then when I'm all done, I'll trim that where I need it so that it's nice and perfect. And then I'll go and do that to the opposite side. Okay, so now what I want to do is trim this U-shaped piece that we put right here. And I am going to use this sort of teal green fringe. And I cut it to about 2 inches, but it's jagged. It's not perfect. And I don't want it to be. And I will just stitch that around that U shape. I will be adding another piece of fringe above it. So I don't need to overlap this with the green fringe. I am going to go just slightly below it because the next piece of fringe will overlap that. So I don't want to overlap it and then the next one overlap, and then I'm starting to cover up this pretty design. So I am going to sew this. I won't pin it or anything. I'll just go to my machine, start all the way at the top, and just stitch all the way around. I'll use a fairly small straight stitch and I'll try to coordinate the colors with my thread. Now the greenish fringe is sewn on. I have this sort of taupey fringe. It's kind of crinkled and crazy. And I'm going to sew that on next, around like this. Okay, but this time I'm going to take that, and here's the top of my green fringe. I am just going to slightly overlap the top of that green fringe so that I don't see any gaps here anymore where the fabric was sewn to the purse. So I'll just take that coordinating thread, fairly small stitch, and stitch that to it. Now I have this taupey color sewn on, and the last piece of fringe I want to sew at the top here is this gimp. It's like a black and ivory and gold color. And I will just overlap this piece when I sew it. I'll just start at one end and stitch it around. And I'll probably use a gold colored thread since this has metallic gold threading in it already. Okay, so now I'm going to take that same taupey crinkly fringe that we used up here, and I am going to cover this seam here. Cover those ugly edges, and I'm just going to sew right on top of that, starting at the corner at the edge. You can come in like 1/2 inch if you want, so that it doesn't get in the way of the sewing machine when we sew the sides together. But this is so thin, it doesn't really matter. I'll probably go all the way to the side. And I will just cover where the two fabrics meet and get that sewn on. Okay, so now I have this sort of brick red tassel fringe, and I am going to sew it just barely, the band of this, not these fringy parts, the band of this, just barely above this piece of fringe here. I actually want them to butt together, not the fringy parts, but this band. I want it to butt together with that last piece of fringe we just sewed on. And it will start here. This one's too short, so I have to piece it together. Just like that. I'll get that sewed on. Okay. Looking beautiful, right? Okay, so now what I want is fringe along the bottom. And I want it to look, it's kind of that teal green fringe again, only this time I didn't cut it, trim it. And I want it down at the bottom of the bag when it's finished. So in order to do that, I have to sew this on a little differently than I did the rest of the trim. Anything that hangs outside of the bag has to be sewn inside the bag, on top of the bag, like this, with the fringe coming inside. So what I'll do is I'll start this fringe about 1/2 inch from the edge, and I won't pin this or anything. I will just stitch this along the very bottom. Just making sure all my fringes are tucked in nicely. And then stop 1/2 inch from the opposite side with all the fringes on the inside. Okay, I just wanted to show you what it's looking like so far. A little different shot than from it just laying on the table. Beautiful colors, right? Okay, let's continue. Okay, so now I have this pretty black fringe. It's kind of lacy, and I'm going to sew that on the sides. And like the bottom fringe, I want it outside the bag. So I am going to have to sew it with the fringes facing inside like this, not on the outside. So I will start stitching down at the bottom or top, whatever, it doesn't matter. And I'll start 1/2 inch up from the very corner, from the bottom, and I will lay it right sides together if there is a right side. And then I will just stitch along the side here. I'll use black thread, and then I'll stop 1/2 inch from the very top. And I will do that to both sides. Okay, so now I want to decorate it, and I'm going to start by adding a red velvet flower right here. And I just feel like I need a little bit more red and a little more dimension, and the flowers I make are nice and dimensional, so I'll show you how I do that. Okay, so I cut a piece of velvet. I had a turtleneck shirt that actually was kind of this burgundy red, and I cut a strip off of that that is approximately 14 inches long and 3 inches wide. Now I'm just going to fold that in half, wrong sides together. I just want to see the velvet on both sides. And then I'm just going to take a needle and thread with matching thread, and I'm going to start at this little corner of the open side here, not the folded side. And I'm just going to put a couple stitches in there so that my thread stays put. Now, along the open side of the strip, I'm just going to weave in and out big stitches, you know, like 1/2 inch stitches. Basically, we're just kind of basting this so we can draw it together. So I am just going to stitch this with large stitches all the way down to the end. Okay, I got those stitches done. They're right along the bottom here. And I still have my needle and thread attached. Now I'm just going to pull on this needle and thread and let that strip pleat like that. Okay, and I'm not pulling it super tight. I don't want to lose. If I pull it super tight, this will shrink up so small that I won't be able to do anything else with it. So fairly tight, just not super tight. Now I am just going to tie this thread off on the end, just loop it through to make a little knot so it doesn't go anywhere. Okay, so this is what it's looking like so far. Now I just dropped my needle and thread to the table because I will need that in a second, and I'm just going to make sure these pleats are all evenly distributed, and then I'm going to just take it and swirl it around, making each little swirl smaller and smaller until I get to the center to where it looks like a flower. And now I have my needle and thread at the bottom. I'm going to go up from the bottom to the top. I try to stay in the middle, but sometimes you have pieces that are outside the middle that you need to catch with your needle and thread, and if you have to do that, that's just fine. Now I'll just keep coming in from the top and the bottom until I feel like I have this securely sewn. Pretty simple. Okay, I'll just keep stitching that until I feel it's secure. And on a purse, you want your flowers to be secure because purses get knocked around and thrown around, and you don't want anything to happen to your flower. Okay, so this is what the front is looking like. And now that I'm done stitching that part, I am just going to make a couple little knots in the back to tie off my thread. Okay. Okay, so I will want my flower about here. But before I do that, I want to add more little fringes that will kind of hang below that flower. And I'll machine stitch them right there where I will sew the flower. And what I'm going to use is, I have a lot of dyed lace because a lot of my projects are dyed and these are leftover lace pieces. So I have kind of a lavender lace, a teal green, and then I have this red lace from a dress. I just cut a strip off. And then I have a couple pieces of sort of ribbon cord type stringy things. And so I will just put these all together in a cluster. Now this red one I folded in half. And I will take that cluster, lay it where I want it, because I know I'm going to want the flower right there. So this is where I want my fringes. And I like when they kind of hang below this bottom layer of fringe. I just think that is kind of a cool effect. So I will go to my machine and I will just simply stitch across this probably about 3 times to make sure it's nice and secure. Okay, so now I have this fringe sewn on, and now I want to sew my flower right at the top of that fringe. And how I sew my flower is I'll just take a needle and thread and go up through the back of the purse and pull it through and get my flower sort of secured on there. And I'll stitch it in about 4 spots. I'll do the center very well, get that nice and secure. And then I'll go about 3 more spots on the flower just to make sure it isn't going anywhere. Now, all this hand sewing that I'm explaining to you, I'm going to do tonight when I'm sitting in front of the TV. So I'm just going to talk to you about it, and then I'll actually hand sew it later. After I get this flower stitched on, I want to do one more thing to it. And I have this brooch. I bought it actually at Hobby Lobby, so it is new, but I just love it. And it's kind of expensive. It was like $18, but I got it 50% off for $9. But I just thought it was so perfect with the jewel tones, and I thought the peacock was kind of whimsical and fun. So I am going to put that right over top, halfway on the flower, or 1/3 of the way on the flower, and partly on the purple. Just like that. And when I stitch it, I will pin it on just so it's where I want it, and it'll kind of hold it in place. And then I experimented with my needle, and there is a little spot up here at the top I can get my needle through, so I'll probably do some stitching there. And then there's little holes here and there. I can do some stitching, here and there. I'll probably sew it in like 3 or 4 spots to make sure it's nice and secure. And I will match my thread with the jewelry piece. I will not match the fabric. That way the thread is hidden a lot better if you match it with the jewelry. So that'll eventually be there. Okay, so next I want to add this vintage brooch and do the same thing. I'll pin it on and stitch any little gaps through any little gaps that I have to make it secure. But I want that about right here. But before I stitch that on, I want to add just like some charms to make it whimsical. And these are some handmade earrings that I have. And I clipped the hook off with a wire cutter at the top. And I will just sew these on one at a time about there. And I'll sew them very close together because I want them to be a cluster. So practically on top of one another. And then when I put this brooch on top, I will cover all the stitching with that, pin that, and sew that. Okay, I'll get that done this evening and I'll come back and show you what it's looking like. Okay, So here is the front all finished with the jewelry sewn on. And this is the end of part 1. So check out part 2. We'll finish the bag. We'll make a strap, do the back, do the lining. It should be right next to this video in my sequence. Otherwise, I'll just put a link in my description for part 2. So be sure to check it out.